revolve around science.
The Science of Society with Elder Darryl Waistline Mitchell.
What's in the news lately? Well, everything is in the news. But I had opportunity to talk about reform and revolution earlier with a young man who he wanted to know why, as we were talking about the 70s and 80s, why we did not pose things as reform versus revolution or reform and revolution. And we was talking about the 70s and the whole drum movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Specifically, I posted an article that was written by the Black Workers Congress back in 1970 calling for an International Black Workers Congress. Now, the Black Workers Congress, it was a former organization that grew out of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, us in Detroit, right? And it proposed the International Black Workers Congress that never came to fruition. And I guess you hear echoes of that today in the various demands and talks about a so-called African working class, meaning all the black workers on earth. And generally, I don't describe the proletariat of the world like that. You know, where you have this African working class that somehow has an existence distinct from the proletariat, right? And then Africa is a continent that's composed of just many different states. And when we take into account the diaspora and all of history, actually, I think we do better talking about a world proletariat and the section of blacks within the world proletariat, that is a black proletariat. And I'm saying that from being part of an organization, right, that was one of the first organizations of black workers to be formed with an open and explicit Marxist type programming platform. In fact, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, we called ourselves Marxist Leninists. And what we fought was a revolutionary struggle for reform because we were completing the last stage of development of what's called the Henry Ford stage of the Industrial Revolution. So the young man said, but what you saying, Comrade Waistline, sounds a lot different from how Rosa Luxemburg looked at the situation. And he quoted some material from her pamphlet, Reform or Revolution, which initially was written in 1899. And then it was titled Social Reform or Revolution. Now, Marxists, what we try to do is couch everything in a specific setting of history. What existed in 1899? Well, in 1899, we're talking about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, from an agrarian society to an industrial society, from mechanical productive forces and means of production to industrial productive forces. So when Rosa Luxemburg talked about social reform or revolution, she's talking about leaving feudalism. And when she faced what they call a revisionist, she's talking about people like Bernstein, for instance, at the Second International, who contend that they had to be a lengthy period of capitalist development before the revolutionaries could try to take power. Now, let me try and gather all that together. In 1899 and 1900s, the revolutionaries in Europe, Germany, they faced a specific situation qualitatively different from what we faced in the United States of America. Right, in 1890, America didn't have no feudalism to begin with. We completed the Civil War in 1865. Right, after that, we're talking about a new form of capitalism arising, which they call financial industrial capitalism. Well, it first made its appearance in the United States of America through financing the Civil War. 50 years later, Lenin in Russia would talk about imperialism as the last stage of capitalism, but it first arose 50 years before Lenin's imperialism. My point is that in the 70s, what we faced was a system that had been expanding since World War II, and this expansion allowed the system to be reformed. What that means is no matter how revolutionary we were, when we fought for our concessions and demands, we were able to win them. And they incorporated new layers of society into the industrial system. So what we faced was a revolutionary struggle for reform rather than social reform, social revolution, or social reform or revolution. It was just posed different. I guess that's what my bottom line is. You know, we have to take those specific features into account, right? Anytime you think you can do something that's not possible yet, you are going to face a problem. But yeah, that's some of what we was talking about earlier today. And we also starting to post a lot of things about the communist movement throughout continental Africa, because each state has a different movement that involves different players and different circumstances and stuff. And we approach it from the standpoint of like proletarian revolutionaries, Marxists. You know, we don't look at Africa and say, well, gee, how can we become part of the African working class? Well, the fact of the matter is that I'm generationally Black U.S., Native America. Like, I'm not Native American, well, part of me is. But my point is that we are very much a part of the history of development that took place in America. You know,
Now, how do we resolve the race issue when it comes to class struggle and social revolution?
well, see,
I don't think that we can avoid it. And a lot of people in the African community tend to shy away from Marxist philosophy because it excludes race.
well, that's absurd. I mean, you got people don't have the information. You got Black Marxists that go back to the Civil War. You know, people, they don't know. They simply don't know that when you talk about the proletarian revolution, Blacks in this country are your first and the original proletariat as slaves. We literally were at the bottom of the social ladder. Plus, when we talk about race, what do we mean by that word? I think by that word, we mean Black. And I think by Black, we describe being colonized. If you are talking about overthrowing the system that colonized you, in my view, you absolutely talking about the color question or race. But for me, it's deeper than that, like, because what we're talking about is human beings, and we're talking about a development of classes and private property that first took place in Africa, thousands of years before white people existed as a part of history, right? Because when we talk about things like white supremacy and this modern, very bourgeois concept of race, when we talk about that, we're talking about something that at the longest is 800 years old, maybe 1,000. But when we talk about classes and private property and that history, we're talking about 10,000 years of history. So my point is that to those who say Marxism don't talk about or speak directly to the question of color, I just have to sit down and make them a list of books. People who say that are saying it out of profound ignorance. It is plenty of, all you got to do is Google it. Google Black and Marxists in the US. Google Black Marxism. Google League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Google Harry Haywood, Nelson Perry, Pettis Perry, Claudia Jones. You can even Google people like CLR James, right? I mean, they just don't know.
I think a good one would be Marx and anti-colonial African struggle or African liberation.
You know, and Marx had a certain view on Africa. I shouldn't say it like that. Marx had a certain view on colonialism during this period of time. But I want to get back to this thing about the idea that the science of Marxism don't speak to the color factor in history is just absurd. Marxism is a science. It's not going to tell you how to get a boyfriend or girlfriend. It's not going to tell you how you should struggle with your boss over a quarter, 50-cent bathroom breaks. That's not what sciences generally do, you know. But it's absolutely an approach that's Black to Marxism in this country. It goes all the way back to the early communist movement and stuff. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, now, how we settle the colonial question, that's a valid question. you know. But I'm convinced that you cannot overthrow white supremacy without overthrowing supremacy. So we have to make a determination what came first. And I can prove that supremacy comes first because white people don't even enter history until what, 5,000 years ago? I mean, before then, what pictures do you see of white folks? You really don't. You know, what you see is a picture of black folks. The further back you go, then you see the browning of Africa that started taking place as a result of Arab invasions and things like that. Well, what we call Arab. I'm saying these things where we have to figure out how to dig deeper into history and distribute some of the existing literature that exists to overcome this notion that somehow revolutionary thought, Marxism, has left out black people. I mean, it's just absurd. You know, it's just absurd, you know. It's really a lack of understanding now. And, you know, some of us are for the communists, Marxists. We haven't had opportunity to distribute our literature broad enough or wide enough. But I think we started off with this question of social revolution, reform or revolution. It didn't pose itself like that for us in the 60s. You cannot create revolution because you convince people they need a revolution. You can't convince them they need a revolution unless some other conditions are present.
That's a really good point, and I hope you kind of dig into that because that's a really good point. I think a lot of people tend to say things like, you know, we have to raise the awareness or raise the consciousness, wake people up, or do the mass education necessary to get people to understand the conditions that they really live under. But can you just dig into why social conditions have to be perfect for any type of revolutionary activity to begin in the first place?
You know, like some of the problem is how we define the word revolution and social revolution. When Karl Marx himself, when he talked about social revolution, he's talking about a qualitative change in the means of production. Technology change in such a way that it compels people to reorganize around a new efficient means of production. Because they're better and more efficient, people reorganize themselves around these more efficient means of production. A plow was more productive, right, than a hoe and a bow and arrow, so people picked up the plow, and the agricultural revolution was on. The industrial revolution, industrial machinery, the industrial engine, the steam engine, it was a new energy source that made a whole new way of life possible, which meant that people were torn out of their old mode of life and brought into a new mode of life, organized around qualitatively new means of production. We call that social revolution. If that is not taking place, you cannot have revolution because you think or feel that it should happen. It's not enough. You have to actually be facing qualitatively new means of production. In 1899, Germany, they were facing a new technological regime, technology complex, called the Industrial Revolution. Germany was at the front curve of development. German engineering is famous. It was Mr. Benz, no, it was, getting old, your memory fade. It was Mr. Mercedes. Who invented this? It was either Mercedes or Benz that invented the combustion engine, right? My point is that Germany was undergoing this deep revolution. In America, right? We were completing the first stage of what's called the factory system and the Industrial Revolution and stuff. The second phase, in my view, was the Henry Ford stage, which starts roughly 1914. My point is that once a country is on the path to the Industrial Revolution, once it's on that path, once society has started being reorganized around a new means of production, the struggle of the workers against the capitalists take place in a certain context, man, where their struggle back and forth drives the system through all these stages and boundaries of development. Now, you couldn't know that in 1899. You can't know that. But after the Henry Ford stage set in, right, people start developing a concept of development based on industrial equipment. After World War II, when Europe laid in ruin, when Japan was all messed up, and the US faced an industrial boom where it drew millions of people into this industrial form of work to rebuild the world, amen, every demand the workers raised. They won some of it, and as they won these demands, the system further expanded. Even if you wanted revolution, how? You can't make a revolution because you think it. Yes, we have to do education, but we are bounded by a certain set of conditions throughout all of our life. And today we see those conditions have changed dramatically over the last 20 years. We deeply into the social revolution that was created from the semiconductor, the microprocessor.
Yeah, technology.
Today we call it what?
Artificial intelligence. Yeah.
Yeah, it's driving a whole new revolution where it's tearing up the old society that was built up on the basis of the Industrial Revolution and the first stages of the digital revolution.
I think Brother Takar, he stresses CAMP, C-A-M-P, computer automated machine production. I think that's what it stands for, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, I have lived through these processes. So yes, I read about them and studied it, but I lived this. I was born during a period of time where it was, the word digital didn't exist. What we talked about was cybernetics. In the Soviet Union, they called it telemechanics. This was like the 60s and going into the 70s. I remember the first digital players, because I got one of them early copies of Stevie Wonder, man, that was on disc, that was gold back then. But see, that's the thing about capitalism. It doesn't take the technology and use it to better the life of humanity. It takes the technology and make consumer toys and goods, because that is what's profitable. So all this wonderful technology go for freaking toys, man. And that's what we lived and experienced. Inside the auto industry, the first wave of robotics come at the end of the 70s and into the early 80s and stuff, man. And that was the first stage of advanced robotics, when they grafted computers onto the assembly line. Then you reach a certain stage of development where the entire process has got to be redesigned, because there's no more pathways, if you will, left in the old architecture. But and everything started going to hell, man. Wages been falling now for 50 years. The society has gotten poorer, more poverty-stricken, more destitute.
Let me ask you your thoughts on this. Especially with social media, you see people always talking about revolution. Oh, revolution, we need to get ready. We're revolutionaries. The revolutionary movement, and you got all these people calling themselves revolutionaries. Are you finding that people even know what they're talking about?
Well, like, the good part is that the practical activity of young people is changing the country. I've never seen this level of demonstrations and mass protests that's taken place over the last 4 or 5 years, right? And in my lifetime, I mark a real change occurring around 2010 with the Detroit Social Forum, because then in 2011, 2012, you had Occupy Wall Street. Then as a turning point, you had the whole incident around Trayvon Martin, right? And you got the resurgence of the social struggle around the police, and then you have Ferguson, which was a turning point. So young people do have a sense of revolution. They have a sense of the destruction of the old society. And our capitalist class, they have think tanks. They're masters at imposing a degenerate bourgeois capitalist world outlook on young people, especially teaching them these foreign ideologies and modes of thought, like that says if you think hard enough, something can become true. That if you feel a certain way, it becomes your truth, And I mean, it's an idealistic form of thought. It's totally backwards, and it's meant to prevent our working class from understanding its mission and what social revolution is all about. But yeah, people in America always felt they're revolutionary. And in a sense we are, because we've been at the front curve of development and stuff. But I mean, we faced with a new revolution today, you know, where we have to distribute socially necessary means of life based on need. Whatever you need, you get. You have that card in your pocket, man, and you get it. You go get it. You know? And I don't mean everybody get a Mercedes Benz, because we're not trying to build cars for everybody. Why? You know, that's a capitalist culture. Yes, cars will exist and stuff, but everybody, well, people, the young people know they don't need no damn cars. It's a convenience that if you want to use it and get access to it, great. But just to own and possess a car, why?
Yeah, I had the conversation with someone the other day, especially in urban centers or urban areas, mass transportation, you know, bus systems, train systems, rail systems, trolleys, or what have you, are the most convenient.
It really is, like, but you know, like, it was the strength of the auto industry, right? You know, and then you had the petroleum industry, which fed it. And there was choices on which direction of development to go into. And in our country, they took the most profitable thing. Instead of electric, they went with petroleum industries, fossil fuel, you know, and the earth suffered from it. We suffer from it, you know, but revolution has got to be looked at in a way where we talking about social revolution changes and how we work, how we live, how we secure our beings, bacon, and shelter. Those means of production, we're talking about changes. And once you got a society where more and more of the actual work that you need to live is being done by machines, how will people pay for the stuff if they can't work and make enough money? If they can't work and make enough money, the only way they can get the stuff is if you distribute it to them without money. There's no other way around this dilemma, you know, and we can afford to do that. We can afford distribution to everybody on earth based on needs, socially necessary needs. That wouldn't be a problem. And it's a labor surplus on earth, so we'll never have to look for work.